Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Just going to wait a couple of more seconds here to see who else arrives, and then we will get into the book recommendations for this video. I hope everyone is doing well tonight, or well, it's evening for me, so. Okay, let's see here. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So this book recommendation video is going to be a little bit different. I have some more fiction material and some more history material and some on just general Islamic thought. So inshallah, let's get right into it. See what we can do here. All right, then. So the first book I want to recommend is a fairly good book with respect to the history of science within Islamic civilization and some of the narratives surrounding that history, some of the erroneous narratives surrounding that history, and a corrective to those narratives. And this is one of the main resources that I use with regard to discussing scientific history in Islamic civilization. And this is by Ahmed Dalal, and it's called Islam, Science, and the Challenge of History. It's a very good book. You can see this one's quite tattered because I've used it quite extensively. But yes, this is a very, very good book. It's quite concise. It's a little bit over 200 pages with footnotes, but it's a very good academic read. And it's highly recommended with regard to the history of science within Islamic civilization. It gives all the facts that we have on hand, and it tries to basically clarify some of the misconceptions about that history, especially from the Western perspective, because many people within Orientalist circles especially like to assume that scientific history within Islamic civilization was primarily, contrary to religious thought, when in fact it was not. So this is a very good book. Okay. Alrighty then. Let's see what else we got here. So another one here is, I've actually met him in person, and I believe I also took a lecture from him at one point. This is another one by Alparslan Achigink, and I can't pronounce his name properly ever for some reason. Islamic Scientific Tradition in History. It's a very thick book, very good. Is more of a perception of Islamic scientific history from an ideological perspective, more about the ideas of how it was formed, etc. So this is also very good. This is actually only part one. I don't think he's actually published part two yet. So this is it's a very good book. I got this in Malaysia as well. So this is I'd say it's a very comprehensive work. So it's actually it takes a lot of time to get through, but I think it's if you can find it, it's worthy of your reading. Okay. So all right, then let's see what else we got here. This is also regarding history, but it's about the caliphate. So it's The Fall and the Rise of the Islamic State by Noah Feldman, a researcher at Harvard. He discusses how the caliphate actually fell by trying to adopt modernistic Western norms of legal theory. And that is actually how the Sharia was eventually undermined and the caliphate fell apart. So very fascinating, very concise read, but worthy of your reading time. Definitely, if you definitely want to understand how the Ottoman Empire kind of fell apart, I think this is one of the best works on the subject matter. Okay, so definitely pick this one up. It's a wonderful read and very concise. Okay, let's see here. All right then. More along the lines of Islamic thought in general, Islamic studies in general. This is one of my favorite books with respect to cataloging the modern interpretations of the Quran and where they come from. So the perspectives of Western thinkers, so-called reformers and orthodox and traditionalists. So it goes through the entire spectrum of interpretation within the contemporary Muslim world and goes through the background of those interpretations, where they came from initially, where they originated, and the main thinkers behind them. But this one is by Massimo Campanini, The Quran, Modern Muslim Interpretations. It's actually a very concise book, but highly recommended if you want to understand some of the perspectives within the Muslim world and how certain individuals read in things into the Quran, or how they read them from a traditional perspective. Okay, also very good book. Finally, within Islamic studies, I would say this is one of the better books on the market. Probably the most comprehensive book with respect to slavery and Islam, both from a historical and legal perspective. And this is by Jonathan Brown, Dr. Jonathan Brown, who I know personally and work with. This is probably one of the best books on the subject matter, if not the only real book on the subject matter, worthy of reading at this current state. Actually, I've talked to him while he was writing this book, and he spent months just nonstop writing this. It is full of a lot of juicy information, a lot of understanding of the subject matter. It's definitely a must read for any of you out there who are concerned about the subject or just want to know about it. So definitely worthy of your time. It is a robust academic work and something that trolls and others cannot comprehend. So, because, they probably can't even read past the first page. But yeah, so this is definitely a heavy read, but definitely worthy of your time. Okay. Let's see what else here. Okay, so let's go into some other things here. Let's talk about more like philosophical topics, but related to specific subjects. So the first one I want to bring is really interesting, by Jeremy Waldron. And I first started reading this book at the University of Georgia. And it's actually quite fascinating with respect to how the United States views free speech and also the rest of the world. So this is interesting. It's called The Harm in Hate Speech. It's actually a philosophical argument for why hate speech needs to be banned in the United States and generally globally. I think it's a really good read. It's backed by a lot of evidence. It showcases a lot of historical accounts and data with respect to how hate speech actually influences society and the inevitable results of that. Of course, the most extreme example being the Holocaust and other such things. But yeah, definitely one of the only books on the subject, okay, that I've found. Really fascinating. Yeah, definitely something to look into. And no, hate speech is not necessarily banned in the United States. The UK, European nations, and other nations deal with hate speech very differently from the United States. The United States has a lot less restrictions on what counts as hate speech. Okay, so there you go. That's interesting. All right, so now let's talk about something a little bit more dreary. Terrorism. So one of the first works that I've read on trying to look at terrorism from a philosophical standpoint, how to define it and what it really is, was by Igor Primoratz. This is a fascinating book. Terrorism, Philosophical Investigation. It's quite concise, but it's also very heavy in terms of its thinking. Tries to define terrorism and what it exactly is. And I use it in my own research, so I definitely recommend this as well. It's well written, and it has pretty robust argumentation. Okay. All right, then. Another book about terrorism. All right. Whew, this one is more from a psychologist perspective. And there are other books that she's written, but this is the one that kind of shot her to fame. So the psychologist Anne Speckhard, and I mentioned this book in another stream recently. It's, okay, by the way, this is going to intimidate you. Okay. So talking to terrorists, so she understanding the psychosocial motivations of militant jihadi terrorists, mass hostage takers, suicide bombers, and martyrs. So she examines mostly suicide bombers, what their mentality is, whether they're actually motivated by religious thinking or there's a psychological issue at play. She comes to the conclusion that Islam has little to nothing to do with suicide bombing and terrorism in general by examining a number of psychological profiles of actual people regarded as terrorists. So she actually went into battlefields. She actually interviewed and did psychological examinations of people who were considered to be terrorists or conducted terrorist acts. And she came to the conclusion that Islam really has nothing to do with it, and that they have specific mental traits that push them down in that way, and usually has to do with grievances with regard to being terrorized themselves. So this is a fascinating book. She also did a book about ISIS members. I haven't actually purchased that one yet, unfortunately. I have it in PDF. But yeah, yeah, great book, something to look into. This book is called Talking to Terrorists. So it's actually a scientific evaluation using real data and evidence to showcase that ideology plays little role in the motivating factor behind terrorist acts. Okay, so that's a big book there. Oh God. Okay, so all right, so now all the depressing stuff's out of the way. Of course, the first couple of books weren't really depressing, but those were kind of. But that's for your own interest. I have more books on terrorism and ISIS and things like that. We may go over those later in a next video. But in the meantime, let's go into fiction books. Yay! And some of you already know some of the fiction books that I love. So let's see here. This book is actually about Islamic history. It's a fiction book about Islamic history. What happened with Al-Andalus, and the Reconquista. And it's by Tariq Ali. It's called Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, Pomegranate Tree. And this is a very interesting book in that it explains the perception of Muslims during the time of the Reconquista and when the genocide was being committed. So this is it's very sad, but it's well written. I think that you would enjoy this. Yep. There you go. Let's see. You know about the other books I'm about to mention here, but I'm going to mention them anyway. I don't think I've mentioned these in the last streams. So the books that I've loved when I was younger, the book series that I loved when I was younger more than anything was a fantasy novel. And many of you have heard me talk about it in the past, but something that I consider better than Harry Potter itself. I don't care what people say. Harry Potter is nonsense compared to this. And that is Redwall by Brian Jacques. Okay. So this is by far the best young adult fantasy series I think ever written. My personal opinion. You can disagree, that's fine. But anthropomorphizes animals, basically. And it's more like in a medieval setting. But it's really well written. It's really good for kids. It teaches about heroism and honor and dignity and what it means to be a moral person, with duty and things like this. So it has a lot of traditional values placed therein, and if you like stories about knights and fighting for the weak and things like that, and mystery and finding sacred weapons and things like that, this is the book that you should start reading for your children. And you can also read it yourself. It's actually quite a good yarn, and so I recommend these books. There's a whole series of them. There's like over 20 books in the series. So, but this is the first one. This is the one that started them all. So Redwall. So if you want to see if you like the series, start this one first. Maybe if you have kids, start them on this one first and see how they like it. And then after that, you can, see if you want to get the rest. All right, then. Last but not least, probably a book that's going to be very controversial here. Not because of the content, but because some people find it extremely boring, or they find it to be one of the best written books of all time. Here we go. The book in question is Moby Dick. Yeah, Moby Dick. I know many of you have already heard of this book by Herman Melville, one of the classic American novels. Very well written, extremely well written. Considered to be the quintessential American novel classic, full of a lot of theological imagery, and it's just a generally good story about mankind, about man's limitations, man's struggles, and purpose in life, etc. So it's one of my favorite books of all time. Obviously, I've read it a few times, and if you can get through it, I recommend it. It's actually not this big. This is actually large type, but it's a little bit. It's a fairly big novel, but it has everything that a story could offer you with respect to adventure and dread and just hope and love and just everything. So it's a very fascinating book. In fact, it's so fascinating that there are some parts of it that it just seem like they don't fit in, but then in fact they do. So, for example, he has a whole chapter here. So Moby Dick's about hunting a whale. That's the general gist of it. But he has a whole chapter here where he discusses body parts of a whale. So the whole chapter is just dedicated to dissecting whales, the anatomy of a whale. And you're wondering, why is it there? And it's actually a metaphor for trying to understand the attributes of the divine, because the whale plays the role of being a metaphor for God. And Ahab plays a metaphor of being like someone who hates God and wants to fight God, and how they're unsuccessful in doing so. And so, yeah, there's a lot of theological imagery here. So you have to read into the symbols and stuff like that. So it's a very deep book. It's not like, you just read the story, you get the story, and that's it. There's a lot of stuff you have to think about. So that's why for some people it may not be an attractive read, but it is interesting, and I think that it is one of the deepest books ever written. So that is what I would recommend as the top classical novel. And that's really it. Those are the books that I want to recommend for this video. I have quite many more to recommend in the near future, but I think that will be sufficient for now. And I hope that you enjoyed those recommendations. So, any questions before we go? I have been reading the chat. And I will eventually be posting these recommendations in the information box for those of you who just want to see the recommendations and go to the links to purchase these books. So no worries about that. All right. I really don't see any other questions here, so I will be ending this stream. Thank you very much for listening. JazakAllah Khayr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.